Hello and welcome to the Ag Culture Podcast, where we share insights about the future of agriculture. Each week we dive into the stories, technologies, and ideas shaping a profitable and sustainable future for farms and rural communities alike. I'm Paul Windemuller, host of the Ag Culture Podcast, and today I'm going to share with you a talk that I did down in Brazil at the MilkPro Dairy Conference back in May. Now, the title of this talk was Why AI Hasn't Changed Yet on Your Farm, and what happens when it does. So if you've been listening to my podcast for a while, some of this might sound a little bit familiar, but I thought this talk really kind of brought a lot of different points that I've been making over the last 2 years together. And I thought it would be a good one to share on where I think we are at with the dairy industry and what it looks like moving forward in terms of technology and technology adoption. Now, there's a lot of excitement around artificial intelligence, but for most farmers, it still hasn't really created the kind of meaningful change we keep hearing about in the general economy. So in this talk, I break down why that gap exists and what has to change in order for AI to make an impact and how it can reshape management once we move beyond having disconnected tools and actually building systems that turn farm data into better decisions. So with that, let's get to today's episode from the MilkPro Summit in Brazil. Boa tarde. That's all the Portuguese I have, so sorry. I didn't start out my career as a dairy farmer. I didn't grow up on a dairy farm. And I never developed that instinct that some of you might have, that you go and look at a cow in a pen and see something is off. I've always admired the people that could do that, but that definitely wasn't me. What I could look at was data and find patterns in that data. That's how my brain works. So this picture was me 12 years ago on this very day, May 28, 2014. That was my first milking as a dairy farmer in my own business in a homemade parlor that I built, milking 30 cows with very, very little investment. Fast forward a couple of years later, I had grown that operation to a couple hundred cows and had installed milking robots. So I want to start out with a little story that illustrated where I was at after having a few years under my belt with the robot technology and all of the data that provided for me. One morning, I walked into our farm office, and our herd manager was in there. And he had something like this pulled up on the computer screen. And he was studying it very carefully. And I took a glance at it for maybe 3 seconds. And then I asked, "What's her temperature?" Then he pulled that up because we had that data. And he said, "It's high." Then I thought for a few seconds and said, "I think she has pneumonia." So what happened in that process there in that few seconds of me looking at a screen like this? I had taken that information, processed it, along with other contextual data that I had in my brain. One of those pieces was what the weather had been doing that week. We had extreme temperature variations over that week. So it was nothing dramatic. None of those pieces of data were dramatic on their own. But when I put them together, it made a very different story. So we caught this cow, and we checked her, and sure enough, she had pneumonia. So we were able to catch her about 16 hours after the very first symptoms in the data appeared. And we were able to treat her early with a successful treatment. And I went back a couple of days later after I thought about this whole process, because I've done this many, many times after the first couple of years of really diving into the data. And I took this picture to show what happens when we're able to catch a cow early and what that looks like with all of the layers of data on there. And that rebound was something that it finally hit me how impactful that was and how important that milestone in my career had become. So again, this is the process that happened in my head. In a couple of seconds, I took a few pieces of information that were on one cow and gave me one insight. Now what happens when you can continually do this with many, many data points across your entire farm, and you have multiple streams coming in of data in specific context to your farm, and all of that can connect instantly. This is exactly what AI is built to do. To do it in a scale and in a time frame beyond what a human brain could ever do, across the whole herd, the whole farm, in seconds. But I want to make sure you don't miss the point of my talk. It's not about technology. As much as I agree with the former minister that was speaking this morning, I do like technology. But I think the story around AI in dairy goes much deeper than that. It's really a story about management. Dairy farming used to be extremely physically demanding, and in many ways it still is, right? That hasn't completely gone away. But that's not the biggest constraint on a dairy farm anymore. Dairy farming is now extremely mentally demanding. The complexity of a modern dairy farm is really, really impressive. It's a complex biological system with lots of variables, and it has outpaced the cognitive capacity of humans to manage it the way we used to. Think through cow health and reproduction, nutrition, labor, the markets and your cash flow in your business, and compliance. Any one of these can shift the economics of your business. Combine them all, and it's a system, again, that's really too complex for any one person to hold in their head completely at one time. And I think that's why a lot of us can feel overwhelmed at times. Not because we aren't capable operators, not because we don't work hard, but because the operation has now outgrown the bandwidth of the people running it. So let's look at an example in history. What happened when AI transformed agriculture? Well, it multiplied physical capacity many, many times. And I like to use that example when I think about artificial intelligence, because electricity didn't take all of the jobs. It didn't make us so we couldn't be dairy farmers anymore. But it maximized what we could do physically. It gave us a lot more capacity for the physical world. I believe AI is going to do the same thing for our cognitive ability. It's not going to take away our ability and our need to have good judgment and to make decisions. But it is going to strengthen how we do that. Now, a lot of you in this room have spent real money on technology to make that shift. You might have bought some hardware, some sensors, some software programs, and now you have data pouring in from every direction. But for some, the decisions still don't feel clearer because most farms added technology without ever redesigning how they actually make decisions on the farm. So this is the gap between the data your farm generates every single day and the decisions that actually improve because of it. And I saw this over and over again as I did a lot of traveling in the last few years and visited hundreds of dairy farms all around the world. And I came up with this concept called the AI profit gap. And I think this is really where a lot of profit potential hides. It's the next profit potential for the industry, for your farms. So to understand where your farm sits, I want you to think about two things. How much data are you collecting, and how much of it actually drives real decisions on your farm? These two axes create four very different farms. The first one is at risk of exit. They have a low amount of data and not a lot of capacity to make high-quality decisions. The next one above it are intuitive veterans. These are people that don't have a lot of data as well, but they're really good at making high-quality decisions. These are the people that I talked about when I first began, right? The person that can look at a cow and just know something's off and knows what to do to that cow to make her feel better. But that knowledge is really hard to transfer if you're in that space. And it's really hard to scale that with your team. The next quadrant here is wasted potential. And as I traveled around, this is where I saw a lot of really progressive farms that were doing a good job, but had a lot of room they could still improve. They had a high quality, high amount of data coming in. They had made the investments to get that data, but they still didn't have something right with the decision quality that they were making. They weren't utilizing the data the way they really wanted to. And the last quadrant is what I call AI leaders. These are people that have high quality, high amounts of data and have figured out how to utilize that through management, through technologies like AI, and really making good, high-quality decisions. And they're not only acting in a way that they're solving problems after they occur, they're looking to catch things before they happen. Now, most of you in this room probably aren't at risk of exit. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't even be here. So we're going to skip that. But I bet a lot of you are sitting in the wasted potential category. And I'm not saying that because I'm trying to put you down. I'm saying that because that's where the majority of farms that I see that are doing a really good job are actually at. You've made the investment, but because the bridge between the data and the decisions aren't built, you're not getting the most out of that data. You're not getting the highest return on investment that you could be getting. And that's the gap that costs us every single day. And this, I want to reiterate, is not a technology issue. It comes down to management and how you develop your workflows on your farm to make decisions. Now, another framework that I developed, because I kept hearing the term, the value of farm data, so many times, and nobody really could explain it well to me. So I came up with this concept, and again, it's four things. I like the number 4, apparently. The first one is action level data. This is data that I was talking about earlier, right? I had a few specific pieces of information that allowed me to have one insight, to have one action to treat a cow. That's very valuable, especially in the day-to-day operations. And a lot of people just stop there with the value of the data that they're getting. The second level is management value. This is where data becomes a business instrument. This is where you're taking in many, many streams of data across the farm to calculate things like your cost of production, or trying to figure out what the change that you made to your reproduction program actually made. The third level is what I call proof value. This is where you prove how your farm is run with your data. It might be to fulfill compliance with animal welfare or sustainability programs. And these are the farms that prove it to the market, that win the contracts and the premiums that come with that. The fourth level is what I call collective intelligence. This goes beyond just your own farm. And I think I heard it mentioned in the panel today. But this is where data connects across multiple farms in a certain region or a certain farm demographic type. This is where industry-wide insights happen, which is also very valuable. Now, every level up that ladder of value multiplies the value of your data that you're already generating. It doesn't just stop at level 1. Okay, so what changes when AI works? That's the second half of this talk, right? Let's go back to that example that I started with again. We caught that cow 16 hours after the first signals appeared, before she was visibly sick, before anyone on my team, including myself, would have pulled her out and looked at her. And because we caught her early, her treatment was much more simple. It only took a couple days. It cost much less. And we didn't have to dump any milk. And she rebounded in production within 24 hours. Now, if we would have missed her by 24 hours, it would have been a completely different story. We've had that in the past, and really we had to treat that with multiple antibiotics that had milk withdrawals, so we had to dump milk. And there was a real chance that they don't make it. Either they'd have to get cold or she'd just die. And that's a $3,500 cow off my balance sheet. But I want you to catch the point in this story. AI didn't replace my judgment. It gave me the right information at the right time to make the right call. That whole process still involved me, but it definitely empowered me to be a much better farmer. And that's what changes when AI actually works on your farm. Again, that one cow, that one moment, that one decision, that's the first level of data value. So what happens when you bring all that data together and that same pattern recognition runs across your entire operation? Each data stream that you have coming in can be useful, but when it's connected, they truly compound. And you can climb that ladder of value much higher. The insights get much deeper, and the speed of the insights can happen much quicker. No, it's not going to be perfect, and it's not going to be stress-free, but it definitely provides more confident decisions. And there's a few things that I saw on farms that were doing this well that I wanted to highlight here. The first one is visibility. The system that flags the cow before she looks sick, before anyone would have noticed, like my story, that happens across the whole herd. And it happens 24/7. And the second is judgment. On these farms, managers are making the calls they used to potentially put off or not enjoy making. Maybe it's culling decisions get made with more confidence. Maybe it's a breeding strategy shift that happens with conviction because the picture is much more clear and trackable. So the cognitive load of those responsible for those decisions drops, and decisions get made more deliberately. The third part is leadership. Leadership will scale. So your new herd manager that you might have hired 6 months ago can make the same quality decisions on reproduction or on animal health as your best person used to after 10 years of work. Not because they're that much better, but the system, if trained correctly, if the person is trained correctly, the system will show him or her the pattern recognition that they haven't built with intuition. So that's what happens when data streams come together. The speed and the depth of insight that no single person can match alone. So the question that many of you might be asking is, so if AI can do this, why hasn't it happened faster? And there's 3 reasons that I want to highlight today. And I've lived all 3 of them personally. The first one is a term that I coined from a fellow scholar. That's dodgy data. An example of this is when I visited a large multi-site dairy in another country during my travels. They had a health problem that they couldn't diagnose. And the treatments looked like they were even being recorded. But they're only being recorded at one facility. man, this facility has a lot of problems, and none of the other facilities have any problems whatsoever. Turns out that the herd manager decided to move all of the sick cows to the one farm without telling the owners. So they weren't treating any of the cows in their entire system other than on that one farm. So this is where clean data really shows how critical it is. It can give you a false sense of confidence if you have bad data. And false confidence on a dairy operation is usually more dangerous than not having any information at all. The second blocker to AI adoption is culture. So a few years ago, I've got a story to illustrate. I purchased a new piece of technology for our farm that was to monitor remotely our feeding. So I rolled it out to our team, and then a few days later, I had to leave on a trip. While I was on that trip, a couple of days later, I got this picture. I saved it on my phone to remind me. You can, if you look closely here, this is the scale head, the remote scale head that we had purchased. But I saved that picture because at first I was angry, but then I realized I shouldn't be angry. It wasn't the failure of our feeder that was in the trash can. The failure was mine. I hadn't brought them along on the journey of why we needed that new piece of technology, why it mattered, what it was going to do for us. I had just dropped it in their laps and expected them to implement it. I'm a true believer in people don't really hate technology, and they're not inherently lazy or stubborn, but a lot of times they resist technology adoption on farm because nobody took the time to make them feel like it was built to help them and like they were part of that decision. So that's your responsibility as a leader on your operation. It can't be delegated to a piece of software or a text message. The second part about culture that I want to bring up is the need to create a culture around the importance of the accuracy of data. So going back to the first bottleneck, if your team doesn't understand the importance of the data and what you're trying to use it for, if they have to manually enter it or keep track of it, it's probably not going to happen. And again, it's not their fault. They're busy doing their work. That's what you want them to do, right? So a lot of times it just doesn't get done or isn't done when it should be. But they need to understand the importance of getting it right if you're going to use that data with AI to make critical decisions. The third blocker is disconnected systems. Right now on my phone, I have 5 apps to monitor things on my farm. And pretty much none of them talk to each other. So to me, that's not the leverage that I'm looking for. But if you think about it, your herd management software was probably really built for your herd manager, and your feed software was probably built for your feeder and your nutritionist, and your accounting software was really developed for your bookkeeper. But none of them were developed for you, the person who needs to understand all of it at once. So the common threads between these blockers is not a technology problem. It boils down, again, to leadership and structure. And solving them is the prerequisite for everything else that I've been talking about. So where do you actually start? Not by trying to transform your whole operation at once, that's for sure. Or by signing a contract with another software company tomorrow, although there might be some here that want you to do that. I encourage you to start by finding one thing, just one. For me, my one thing, a couple of years after I got rolling in dairy farming, was something relatively simple. And that's deciding when to breed my cows. Remember, not being an intuitive cow person, every breeding decision on my farm, whether I was going to do it or somebody in my team was going to do it, used to be a moment of doubt for me. I was horrible at it. So that's the area that I let data take over, the cognitive load. We had activity collars, and the system flagged the cows with the multiple streams of data that we had coming in, and we'd breed the cows. And within a year, I went from well below industry average to well above it, and our cull rates dropped dramatically. So that was my one thing that really changed how I viewed what I could do with my farm and what happens when I really drilled into one specific area and tried to solve it, and being able to do it with technology. So here's 3 questions. If you're interested in developing an AI strategy for your farm, this is where I would recommend starting. Go home and think through, what decision do I make repeatedly on our farm that follows a pattern that utilizes data? What am I losing sleep over because I can't see what's going on clearly with the numbers? And the third one, what task is burning out a key person on my team? So just pick one of those, think through that, pick one of those, and then prove to yourself and prove to your team, in order to build their trust, that this can make an impact in your business. And then go forward. So I want to leave you with one last thought. For most of my career, the conversation about dairy competitiveness has been about scale. Big farms versus small farms, or robot farms versus parlors. But I don't think any of those are going to be the defining divide in the future. I think integrated data operations versus fragmented data operations will be the next great divide. Farms that build connected systems where information moves, where decisions get easier over time, those farms are going to operate on a completely different playing field than the rest. And this isn't a threat. I just want to make that very clear. But we've seen it with other industries like banking and retail and healthcare, and I think dairy is going to be next. So the farms that learn to see clearly inside their own operations, their complex systems, they won't just protect themselves better, they'll operate on a different level entirely. So I hope you truly understand after this that you cannot think about AI on your farm without understanding how your view of your own farm management and what your relationship is to data. So I encourage you to find your one thing and start when you go home. Well, I hope you enjoyed my talk that I did down in Brazil at the MilkPro Summit, and I just want to say thank you to Marcelo Carvalho, who hosted me down there. He's a well-known person in the Brazilian and South American dairy industry. Go back to early June and listen to the episode that I did with him while I was at the conference. That was also very interesting talk about the Brazilian dairy economy and dairy industry. So that wraps up another week, and I just want to say thank you to the friends of the show that support what we do here, that allows us to produce content to you ad-free. Check them out on our website or our newsletter, and thank them for supporting what we do. And so with that, thanks for listening, and we will see you next week for another exciting episode of the Ag Culture Podcast.